I can't be the only one who remembers. I just can't. It's been over a week since it happened, but no matter how many people I ask, and no matter how hard I try to look for evidence, I just can't find anything to prove what happened. To make matters worse, those responsible for what happened are onto me. I don't know how long I'll be safe before they do something. How is it possible that billions of people forgot about the invasion? How is it possible that you all forgot the death and devastation? How is it possible that they managed to wipe everyone's mind but mine? It feels so frustrating knowing it happened, yet finding no one else who remembers. Every time I ask those who I knew weren't one of them, the reaction that I get is always the same. A dismissive shake of the head and laughter. For some reason, they always think that I'm either pulling some kind of prank on them or that I've lost my mind. But I'm not. This is no prank and this is not some crazy dream either. I know the difference between a dream and reality. There are too many details, too many memories ingrained in my mind to make it just a dream. If it was a dream, then it would have been foggy at best, and I would have forgotten bits and pieces of it. But the memory is clear, and the fear that I felt during the invasion is still embedded in my head, and it still makes me shake every time I remember it. I couldn't have dreamt it. What I remember is real and I'm sure of it, but no one else can remember, at least no one that I know. I have never felt alone like this before, but I guess it's now up to me to tell everyone what happened. Maybe, just maybe, my recounting of the invasion would remind it all to you, or at least to some of you. Now, I was and still am in the army. I'm a platoon officer, a second lieutenant. For my position, I wasn't able to get the whole picture of what had happened. However, I did get enough information from news reports and intelligence briefings to paint a good enough picture. What I'm about to tell you now is my retelling of the events from what I remember. So, let me start where it all began, on the day that spaceship entered Earth's orbit. It came as a shock to us all, especially to the various space agencies around the world. One day, everything was normal. And then the next day came and we now had a massive spacecraft orbiting Earth. No one knew how it got there, and NASA claimed that it would be impossible for them, or anyone watching space, to miss an object that large heading towards Earth. If it had entered the solar system or made a trajectory towards Earth, someone should have noticed. So it seemed that the spaceship had just appeared out of nowhere, as if it had teleported there. One of the intel boys, a friend of mine from Division HQ, told me that observations from NASA and Space Force satellites, as well as various high-powered ground-based telescopes, revealed that the object was a spherical-shaped vehicle, made out of an unknown material, and having a diameter of 10 miles. Because of this description, many people who saw it began referring to it as the Death Star. It seemed appropriate at the time, but now that I think of it, and knowing the purpose of the Death Star in the films, the idea of naming an alien spaceship after it would do little to reassure people. My friend would later tell me that this name did indeed displease the higher-ups, as many members from the government's upper echelon felt uncomfortable and fearful of the unknown sphere and Earth's orbit. Soon, though, it was the general public's turn to fear. It didn't take long before professional and amateur astronomers began releasing images of the spaceship, as telescopes looked up at the sky to stare at the visitor from God knows where. Almost immediately, panic ensued, as governments and people wondered where the spaceship came from and what those inside of it wanted with us. Major world issues such as the pandemic, global tension, environmental disasters, a fuel crisis, and many more were completely dropped and forgotten, as headlines everywhere covered the gigantic orbiting vessel around the planet. Within the first few days, the panic turned into general hysteria. as many people in major population centers started to panic buy. This action then resulted in shortages at overstrained groceries and markets, which in turn resulted in more panic. As this panic raged, people began to roam the streets in search of any place where supplies were still abundant. Scattered among these mobs of panicked people were the lawbreakers, who wanted to ride the tide in order to hide their crimes. Soon enough, cases of looting, vandalism, and assault began popping up, and with the chaos and disorder, it became harder and harder for law enforcement to control the crowds and to maintain order. So that's when we were called up. One moment, we were watching the chaos unfold in national news. The next, we were sent up on a 6x6 truck to New York City in order to assist the police and the National Guard in restoring order to the state's economic center. The state governor had just declared a martial law that day, and within a few hours of the declaration, we were setting up checkpoints on all the roadways of New York City. Order did seem to return after this, although everyone was still on edge, as the alien spaceship continued to mock us with its silence. In an attempt to learn more about the alien vessel, and to gain communication with them, since all ground-based attempts had failed, NASA announced a plan where they would send out their most experienced astronauts and rendezvous with the massive spaceship. This was met with mixed reactions by the public, as some feared that disturbing the spaceship would trigger a catastrophe. Others, however, supported the idea, as their curiosity to know what the spaceship was urged them on. I belonged to the latter group. I believed that we needed to make contact and figure out what these aliens wanted. The sooner that we know the answer, the faster we can react to their intentions. However, the mission didn't go as planned. As the astronauts' vehicle reached orbit, they suddenly disappeared. Without any warning, telemetry and communication was lost, and satellites would later confirm that their vehicle could no longer be located. Within the blink of an eye, a commercial crew programmed spaceship and its 4 crew members disappeared without a trace. To make matters worse, a couple hours after the loss of the astronauts, some kind of event occurred all over the planet, striking all major cities around the globe. In New York City, I got to witness this event firsthand, since I was inside when the city was engulfed in a massive bright light. I remember feeling no pain or terrible sensation from this event, although the light emitted was blinding, as its brightness prevented me from seeing anything around me. It didn't last long though, and after a few seconds it disappeared, leaving everyone dazed and unharmed. However, a shocking revelation came after that. As we all looked up into the sky, we could see hundreds of strange orbs hovering above the buildings of the city. Through a pair of binoculars, I saw that the orbs were smooth and perfect spheres, with their surface being made out of some kind of silver-like material. Staying above the buildings for a good few minutes, they soon began to descend in unison, with the orbs navigating their way towards the streets. Soon enough, one of them had lowered itself on top of the checkpoint that we were manning near Times Square. I was at this specific checkpoint at this time, inspecting the positions of one of my platoon squads, when the orbs slowly came towards us in a smooth and straight flight down. As it got closer, I got a better look at the strange object, and from my rough estimates, I would say that it was around 20 feet in diameter. Keeping my eyes fixed on the object, while having my men train their weapons on it, we watched as the orb continued its descent until it was floating just 5 feet off the ground. Immediately positioning ourselves to surround it, I passed on a strict order for everyone to maintain proper trigger discipline. The intentions of these aliens were still unknown during that time, and I didn't want to be the officer responsible for starting an interstellar war. If only I knew better. If only we all knew better. Then again, what difference would it have made? Our guns, rockets, and our most sophisticated weapons stood no chance against them. Soon enough, I became a witness to their sheer strength as I watched the orb morph into something from nightmares. With a fleshy, unsettling sound and a disgusting, terrible sight, the outer layer of the orb began to peel off, revealing hundreds of eyes all over its surface. Watching in shock and horror, all of us stood there with uncertainty and fear, as the silver-like skin of the orb was removed in order to show the true face of these hideous creatures. With its smooth exterior gone, the orb now looked completely different. Staring at it, I felt a shiver run down my spine as I noticed multiple sets of eyes stare back at me. Unblinking and cold, those eyes stared at my very soul as it kept its gaze directly at me. The other sets of eyes did the same to the rest of the platoon as we all stared in horror. As we remained paralyzed in fear, the orb-like creature continued with its transformation as it began to grow out dozens upon dozens of thin 10 feet long arms out of its body. Popping up between some of the eyes, these arms extended from its main body, stretching far as the sharp, claw-like fingers at its end flexed itself before us. All of us stared in awe at this creature that was once the clean orb. This was nothing like any creature that we had seen before. Standing frightened with their rifles aimed at the creature, my men did their best to hold their ground and await my orders. But I didn't know what to do. I just stood there and stared. I know that I should have given the order to fire, or at least told them to distance themselves from it. But that's just hindsight talking. At the time, the creature may have been ugly, but it still showed no hostile intent. Like I said, I didn't want to be the one responsible for starting a war. And taking advantage of the inaction, the creature decided to make the first move. In a sudden and swift motion, its many hands began to stretch farther and reach out towards us, with some of them managing to catch a few of my soldiers who stood too close to it. Quickly shaken out of our paralyzed and mesmerized state, we watched on with horror as these arms lifted our friends and brought them close to its body. Looking on with both fascination and fear, I saw the hands shove these poor unlucky men against its skin, which seemed hard and firm based on the sound of the impact, and then they were all slowly sunk into its flesh-like surface as I observed the men phase through the skin and be swallowed up into the unknown interior of this creature. Screaming and flailing in panic, they desperately tried to get away. However, the long, horrible hands pushed them deeper into the skin, as the body itself seemed to absorb and swallow them. The next thing we knew, the men captured by the orb had vanished, having sunken deep within it. This was then followed by the sight of blood dripping from the creature's many eyes, as if it were crying out the liquid. A steady stream of this blood flowed out of it, till the pool began to form on the street below. What we witnessed was more than enough of a signal for us to know that the creature was hostile, and the remaining men in my platoon didn't wait for my order to open fire. Unleashing all they had, the men began peppering the creature with rifle fire, but despite its seemingly fleshy skin, the bullets did little damage to it. Every single shot was merely absorbed by the creature, as it swallowed the lead and absorbed it. Even the eyes seemed impervious to bullets, as they merely took in the bullets and stared at the one that had fired at it. Reacting to our actions, I noticed some of the hands began to extend out once more, as the whole body of the creature began to move towards my direction. Seeing this, I ordered the men nearby to fall back quickly, or else suffer the same fate as their unfortunate friends. Most of those near me managed to quickly back away, but the saw gunner from the squad moved slower than the rest. Firing at full auto, he let loose his weapon against the advancing creature, as if trying to cover his squad as they repositioned themselves. I desperately tried to order him to stop the foolish attempt and immediately retreat, while his squad leader did the same thing. But he didn't listen and instead continued to pour it out on the creature. It wasn't until the creature got within 15 feet away from him that he finally decided to turn around and run towards us, but by then it was too late. Lunging an arm at him, as the creature's claws managed to snag him just as he was turning around, we tried to cover him by firing at the creature, but just like before, it had no effect. To our frustration, we could do nothing more than just fire and watch, as the creature slammed him against its skin and absorbed his body. After this, I knew that I had to make a decision quickly. I contemplated if we should hold our ground and wait for reinforcements or retreat and reorganize. Listening to the comms network, I could hear the panicked cries of our other checkpoints, as similar creatures attacked their positions. Reinforcements were clearly not going to come soon if I had asked for them. At the same time as I was making my decision, an explosion erupted from the other side of the creature. Noticing a trail of smoke, I realized that some of the men on the other side decided to fire their javelin launcher to see if it would work against the creature. It didn't. Instead, all they did was attract the creature towards them, as it began floating towards their direction. Realizing that no weapon in our inventory could stop it, I gave the order to mount up and abandon the checkpoint. I sent out a similar order to the rest of my squads manning other checkpoints, but I got nothing back from them. Heading towards the Humvees parked nearby, we quickly got on board and decided to head towards the direction of the Empire State Building, where the battalion headquarters was supposed to be. At the same time, we made plans to drive our vehicle along the side of the road, hopefully beyond the reach of the creature's arm, and rescue these squad members on the opposite side. However, the sudden screams that erupted from the direction, as well as the sight of them being lifted up and absorbed by the creature, it told us that it was too late. I felt a surge of fright run through me at this point, as I knew there had been substantial distance between them and the creature. It seemed like it was moving faster now. Not wanting to know if my theory was right, I gave the order to move out, and so we left on one Humvee and began navigating the road towards the Empire State Building. As we drove, we saw a lot of pools and trails of blood along the road, a mark left by the creatures after consuming their victims. Doing our best to avoid any more encounters with the creatures, we tried to avoid following the trails, as it might lead us to one of them. Many civilians were already on the street at that point, trying their best to flee from the creatures, but I noticed there weren't as many as I thought there would be. I assumed that a good number of the population in the area either decided to remain in their homes and died there, or head underground in the subways. Attempts to contact my other squads were met with static, and similar attempts to get in touch with my company commander and battalion HQ were also fruitless. As we continued our cautious journey towards battalion headquarters, taking detours along the way in order to avoid the creatures, I began to notice something strange occurring at the Empire State Building. Various creatures were flying up towards the tower, while at the top a gigantic orb had formed. Based on what I was seeing, I assumed the orb was made out of multiple creatures, as I saw them fly towards it and merge into the larger orb. Watching this unfold, I began to wonder if it was still a good idea to head towards the buildings. Eventually, our plans were changed when we had encountered two soldiers by the entrance of a building. Turning my gaze towards them, I noticed that they were signaling us to side off and stop. Parking just in front of them, I soon realized that one of the soldiers was Major Collins, my battalion commander. Recounting his story, he said that the creatures somehow managed to phase through the walls of the buildings and grab men from the outside. With such power, it didn't take long for them to annihilate the staff of the headquarters, with only him and his RTO being lucky enough to escape the building. Any attempts to contact Regimental and Division HQ was met with empty static also, although he did say they managed to intercept a brief transmission from a National Guard division which reported similar attacks were happening at Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, London, Moscow, Paris, Manila, and Tokyo too. He assumed that there were many more attacks happening in other cities around the world, but they haven't had contact with anyone else to confirm this. This news severely demoralized us as we realized that the whole world was under attack. Formulating a plan, Major Collins said that the best thing to do now was to escape from Manhattan and to head for New Jersey, where we might find some kind of organized military force. Realizing that it was too dangerous to go that far above ground, we decided that we would abandon the Humvee and instead move on foot through the subways. However, as we made our way to the nearest subway, a bright light blinded us once more. This time though, the light was different. Instead of the white brightness of earlier, the light now was red, and its impact more harmful. I felt my body heat up as the light continued to intensify. It was a terrible sensation, discomforting at first but slowly becoming more and more unbearable. The pain seemed to stab every nerve of my body, as I felt like I was being burnt alive. Overwhelmed by the sensation, I began to scream while flailing my hands as if it would do something to stop the pain. It was terrible, and I looked around and tried to listen to my surroundings, hoping to find any kind of help that would relieve me from my experience. There was none though. I couldn't see anything but red, and I couldn't hear anything but silence. It seemed like I was suffering alone, but just as the painful sensation was reaching its peak, it abruptly stopped, as all the burning feeling disappeared. In a sudden change, the pain was gone, and as I looked around, I noticed that the light was gone and I could see once more. But as I looked around my surroundings, I noticed something odd. I was no longer in the streets of Manhattan. Instead of seeing tall skyscrapers, the bloody streets, and the panicked expressions of my fellow survivors I was with, what I saw was the mundane environment of my officers' quarters, the same one that I felt before we were ordered out. Standing in the middle of the room, I felt confused and lost. This was the last place I expected to be. Looking around in disbelief, I soon began rummaging around my room, trying to find out what had happened. The date was still the same though. The time was also the same, and yet where I stood was no longer the same. I'm not sure what had happened, but I'm sure what I experienced was not some kind of dream. What I remember actually happened, yet somehow no one else could remember it. When I exited the room and talked to the other officers that I shared the bachelor's office quarters with, they stared at me and laughed. They were convinced that I was pranking them. To my great frustration, I couldn't find anyone else who remembered what had happened. I just felt even more lost, as I couldn't explain what had happened. However, this wasn't the only thing that I found strange. Going around the base, I was shocked to notice unfamiliar faces in my unit. People I didn't know were taking up the places who had died in New York. The soldiers that I saw dying in the streets of New York were no longer there, and instead they had been replaced by men that I had never seen before. I really don't know who they were, yet everyone acted as if they had been in the unit the entire time. I didn't trust them though, and I was wary of them as I did my best to talk to them as little as possible. Avoiding the new men and continuing my efforts to figure out what had happened, I began asking the men that I was certain were with me during the invasion. I decided to first talk to the squad leader that I had been with in Manhattan, questioning him on whether he felt something odd or if he had been having strange dreams. In response, he just stared at me as if I was insane, and gave awkward replies saying that he felt fine. Any attempts to talk to anyone who had been there would be met with the same result. If there was someone who did remember, then I would have heard them talk about it by now. So I gave up on the interview, knowing that it was attracting some unwanted attention, instead of helping in my efforts. No one in the unit remembered. No one except for me. I did, however, try to investigate more about the replacement men. It baffled me how they could simply take over the lives of others, as if they were really a part of those lives that they were in, and not mere fillers to the men who had died. Because of this, I decided to write to the father of Sergeant Henry, a member of my platoon who I was certain had died in New York and was replaced by a new man who called himself David. David did not look like Henry, but he seemed to be trying his best to be like Henry. He was replacing that man's life, but as to what purpose, I don't know. I wondered how deep they managed to replace Henry in the memories of the survivors, and whether it was only with those he normally interacted with every day, or if it was also affected family members who he hadn't seen for a long time. It was because of this curiosity that I decided to write to Henry's father. From previous conversations with Henry, I knew that he and his father were not on good terms. Henry had decided to join the army against his father's wishes, and because of that, the two hadn't talked since the day Henry had left the family home and signed up. His family info was still in the unit's records, although the name and physical info on file was David's rather than Henry's. Aside from that though, his parents' name and address looked the same as when I last saw them. Taking the address, I then wrote Henry's father a letter telling him that his son had shaped up to be a good soldier, and that he should be proud to know that he was a sergeant in the army now. The letter that I got in return nearly broke me. He informed me that he had no son named Henry, but he did have, and I quote, an ungrateful, disobedient, and reckless son named David. He then went on a rant about David and explained how he wasted his life by joining the army, instead of following him in the family business. I felt shocked, drained, and after having read that, since Henry had told me the same story before, it was the same story, only a different person. After that, I found myself wondering maybe there wasn't really a Henry, maybe it was David all along. Why was I worrying over nothing? Should I be believing what I remember? Was I having false memories? Feeling defeated, I almost gave up. For a moment, I thought that it might have indeed been a dream, or I may have indeed started going crazy. At one point, I was already contemplating if I should tell my captain about what I was experiencing, and ask if I should schedule myself for a psychological evaluation. However, before I could fully give up, I saw what the replacement men really were. It was in my quarters that night, staring out my window and wondering what had happened to me. Looking up at the night sky, I stared at the full moon and felt strange at how I remembered it being brown before, not white. Shaking my head, I couldn't help but feel frustrated, not knowing if I was going crazy or not. Finally thinking that I needed to shrink to see what was wrong with me, I decided to turn in for the night and get some rest. However, before I could turn away from the window, I saw something that caught my eye. As I glanced towards that direction, I felt a shout of fear go through me as I stared wide-eyed. Two figures were walking towards the BOQ building that I was in, yet my eyes fell on the one that was disfigured and horrifying, like a blob of flesh and eyes. The figure that moved looked like a monster. I felt petrified staring at it, as it somehow moved forward, swaying as it did so. I stared at the monster with disgust and fear, as I wondered where it had come from. I had to blink a couple of times to make sure that I wasn't imagining it, but as I continued to stare, it remained right in front of me. I wanted to hide, to get away from that thing, as I felt that it was related to what I remember I'd experienced in New York. However, something curious attracted my attention. The figure next to it, a lieutenant that I knew and shared the BOQ with, stood next to the monster, yet paying no mind to the horror. This shocked me as much as the sight of the terrible creature. I wonder how he wasn't terrified or unnerved by it. But as the two moved closer to the building, they were soon covered by the structure's shadow, which blocked off the natural moonlight from above. Once this happened, my eyes widened once more as I stared out intently. The monster, the terrible, disgusting thing, was now gone. In its place was a man, one of the replacement men who took the place of another officer that I knew. Shock woke up my mind, as I realized that the horrifying monster was that replacement man. Although I had seen him as an ordinary person just like everyone else, The light of the moon somehow revealed the truth to me. As I took this piece of information in, I began to realize that all of the replacement men must truly be terrible monsters of flesh and horror beneath their facades. I felt goosebumps run through my skin as I suddenly felt cold. In my platoon alone, nearly 2/3 of my command were replacement men. The thought of those monsters surrounding me every day scared me. That night, I remained awake, fearing that one of those fleshy monsters would burst into my quarters and swallow me itself, just like how those creatures had killed my men in New York. After what I had learned, I stayed away from the replacement men more than ever. So now I'm here, searching online if anyone else remembered the invasion. I can't be the only one. There has to be somebody else who remembers. Nearly everyone has forgotten, but I hope that there's someone else like me. But this message isn't just a search for those who remember. This is also a warning for those who don't. I want you to know that those creatures are still there, and they still aren't done with us. What they want, I'm not sure, but I can tell that it's nothing good. So be careful then to keep an eye out for them. Also, can anyone tell me if they feel something is wrong with the moon? I know that I said it helped me reveal the true nature of the replacement men, but I still feel something strange about it. The other night, I was staring at it, wondering why I remember it being a different color, when I suddenly felt the uneasy feeling of it staring back at me, as if each crater were eyes bearing down on me.